Greetings, and welcome to Conversations with, Exploring Hard Decisions While Living with ALS, presented by ALS United Greater New York with our staff hosts Nancy Brenner and Debbie Schlossberg. This series of recorded interviews with a variety of special guests will explore and present topics which are sometimes sensitive, personal, or may not be addressed in regular support groups, but which we know often provoke thought and deep questioning.
Hello, everyone. My name is Debbie Schlossberg, and I'm the Chief Care Service Officer at ALS United Greater New York. And together with my colleague, Nancy Brenner, we're very happy to welcome you today to our newest installation of Conversations With. Conversations With is ALS United Greater New York's program where we have recorded interviews, conversations with guests, around topics having to do with personal decision-making, end-of-life issues, and planning. Today, we're very, very happy to welcome our guests, Mary Ellen Markant and Marjorie Focarazzo, representatives of the Funeral Consumer Alliance. Nancy, take it away.
Welcome, everybody. Today, we have with us two very knowledgeable guests in the area of end-of-life planning. Mary Ellen Markant has a foundation in nursing education and works as an end-of-life educator in her independent venture, Signature Sunsets. She presents community programs, creates resources, collaborates with relevant organizations, and hosts discussion groups. She launched Death Cafes in Rochester, New York in 2014 and promotes learning in a way that creates comfort. Marjorie Focarazzo is a retired higher education instructor with a degree in adult education. She is currently the president of the Greater Rochester Funeral Consumer Alliance, FCA, and the vice president of the National FCA. FCA's mission is to educate consumers about their legal rights when it comes to funeral options. Marjorie encourages pre-planning and communication with family and friends. Today, Marjorie and Mary Ellen will discuss what to consider when making arrangements at a funeral home, with emphasis on what to think about ahead of time before the impact of death and all the emotions that cloud one's judgment and heightens vulnerability. Thank you so much for being here with us. And to get us started, can you address what people should know before arriving at a funeral home?
Well, thank you, Nancy and Debbie. Great to be here. So it's wise for anyone who might have to make arrangements someday following a relative's death to become aware of state regulations and rights established by the Funeral Trade Commission, outlined in what is termed the funeral rule. So every state has their own regulations and rules. But in New York and in New Jersey, certain services of a funeral director are mandatory, including transporting from the place of death, filing the death certificate, and permit acquisitions and supervision of the final disposition of the body, be it internment or entombment or cremation. In addition to changes and charges for services, a fee for overhead and basic operating measures is allowed by law. Termed a basic services or non-declinable fee, the amount varies significantly among different funeral homes. It should be a factor when comparison shopping because it cannot be avoided.
It's also important to know that no state laws require embalming except under atypical circumstances. Embalming is only a temporary delay. It affords only a temporary delay in decomposition, but it may be a funeral home requirement if there will be a public viewing with an open casket. Some states specify that embalming or refrigeration is necessary if the body is not buried or cremated within a certain time. In New York, a funeral director must obtain approval to embalm. Consumers should know that they do not have to buy a casket or urn at a funeral home. They can get these items online at a local store or someplace else, including a non-retail constructed coffin or casket and have it shipped to the funeral home without any extra fee charged for receiving and handling. In New York, it is legal to use an unfinished wooden box or a so-called alternative container made of cardboard, unfinished wood, fiberboard, canvas, or other material, as long as it meets cemetery requirements. Some metal caskets are sealed with rubber gaskets to minimize entry of air, dirt, bugs, and water. This rubber piece along the rim of the casket does not keep a body from decomposing, but rather causes acceleration of the process. Moisture is retained inside and air cannot escape. For entombment in a mausoleum, sealer caskets are apt to be prohibited, as they can lead to container swelling and profoundly deleterious consequences. A gasket just adds to the cost of the casket. In addition to the primary casket purchase, people should be aware that cemeteries may require use of an outer burial container into which the burial receptacle is placed. The reason for it is to prevent ground sinkage over the course of time, as well as making grounds maintenance easier. Either a vault or a liner serves this purpose. Vaults are sturdy, sealed containers, typically made of concrete, steel, or composite materials. The less substantial concrete grave liners are sufficient, so there's no need to buy a heavy-duty vault from a funeral home.
So there are cash advanced items for goods or services that a funeral provider has and can be purchased from a third party on behalf of their customer. The funeral home may make these purchases if you choose not to do so directly, and then pay the vendors with the money the client has given them. The funeral home cannot charge a handling fee beyond what the vendor charges. Examples include multiple copies of death certificates, permits, flower arrangements ordered, obituary and death notices, a fee for use at another establishment, such as a church or a synagogue, the crematory fee for the actual cremation, food or beverages, facility rentals, payments to cemeteries, clergy, musicians, pallbearers. If you choose to use personal affiliated with the funeral home, etc.
Rather than heading to the nearest funeral home or the one used for granddad's arrangements, it behooves people to compare facilities ahead of time, before a death occurs. Prices at funeral homes within the same community vary remarkably, not only for services and merchandise, but also for the basic services non-declinable fee. Comparison shopping can save thousands of dollars. Funeral homes are required to give prices over the phone without an imperative for callers to give names, addresses, or phone numbers. If there's a local funeral consumers alliance, a price survey of funeral homes that's available to members is extremely useful. Also, websites for both the National Funeral Consumers Alliance as well as local affiliates have a lot of pertinent general information.
This is really great information and things that many people would never even know about. Do you have any other incidental tips?
When going to a funeral home to make arrangements, it can be useful to bring certain documents, such as the decedent's birth and marriage certificates and military discharge papers, in addition to the decedent's Social Security number. If a document with funerary preferences or arrangements had been prepared, that would be essential too. Also, it's wise to go with a companion who is in less emotional upheaval than oneself, and better able to assess offerings objectively and retain information. Conventional practices tend to motivate a robotic approach to making arrangements based on familiar scenarios. That is, people tend to have a preconceived mindset that dictates an objective of making arrangements for standard fare the way it's always been done. But being open-minded and receptive to less typical options can expand horizons and make for a more personalized and meaningful experience.
It makes so much sense. And as we've been learning through this series, there are so many questions that we don't know that we can ask and options that we have. So what should a person expect when making arrangements at the funeral home?
Okay, so when you go to the funeral home, the first thing that the funeral director should be given you is a general price list. Now, this includes all their services and goods offered by the funeral home. If also shown a list of package or bundle prices, look first at the general price list. Determine what you want, and then check the package prices to find out if there's a cost advantage. Otherwise, bundled pricing could inadvertently result in purchase of unwanted items. So you should just check the whole document to see if they're bundling things, and then look at them at sort of like a la carte and see if you're really going to save any money by having certain services bundled together. Casket prices, they may have just a general list on the general price list from, say, this price to that price, but they may also give you a general price list for caskets. And this also should include an alternative container. Caskets are not required for cremation, which should be stated, but if you're going to have calling hours before a cremation, there is possibility of renting a casket for use during those calling hours. And likewise, a price list for the outer burial containers, what Mary Ellen just spoke about. That should also be available to you when you go to see a funeral director. There is also a general price list on their general price list, but it's not specific enough. So you should be asking about looking at the general price list in particular for both the caskets and the outer containers. Once arrangements are made, you'll be given an itemized statement of all the items that you have chosen to purchase, with the cumulative amount recorded at the bottom. It will also include an estimated cash advance fees, which you should be checking with the funeral director. What do I need to pay up front? And the itemized statement, this particular statement, which should be itemized and have every single thing that you want to purchase, is your contract with the funeral home. So what questions should you ask?
Yeah, it seems like this is it's important to remember that planning a funeral is a business. And so there seems to be a lot of things to take into consideration. What would you suggest people ask?
Well, if the decedent had specified use of this particular funeral home, are there any preferences on file or pre-established contracts? If a direct burial or direct cremation is chosen, what fundamental services are included? Is there an additional fee for the actual process of cremation by way of a third-party facility, in addition to the amount stated on the general price list? Is use of a rental casket, like Marjorie mentioned, is that an option if there is a public viewing service? A rental casket is a standard-looking casket with a removable inner container that's used for a single service and then disposed of, with the outer shell kept for reuse. Another question would be, what is the non-declinable generic services fee charged at this particular place? Is embalming required at this funeral home for a public viewing or visitation? Can there be a private family viewing without embalming? If temporary preservation is a practical necessity, is refrigeration available and at what cost? If not already known through general resources, what veterans' benefits are available? What is done to support a specific religious or cultural affiliation?
So it sounds like many of the tools and skills that all of us should have as careful consumers really do come into play here as well. But can you dig down a little bit deeper and tell us some specific ways that we can minimize expenses?
So the least costly option at the funeral home is a direct burial or direct cremation without the traditional proceedings, such as a public viewing or visitation or a ceremony, except possibly for a brief graveside service.
Aim to purchase basic alternative containment rather than a substantial casket, especially one with a gasket or decorative embellishments. Doing so can save a lot of money. Likewise, if an outer burial container is required by the cemetery, a basic liner rather than a hefty vault is far more economical. Cost savings can be realized also by avoiding embalming and public events in the funeral home, perhaps redirecting the planning to possibilities for use of community sites. Gatherings for family and friends are important, but they can be arranged independently apart from a funeral home facility.
Thank you for that information. It's really helpful to know that there are ways to save some money and that there are things that people don't need and might not be aware of. Are there any cautions that people should be aware of when they are shopping for services and merchandise?
Well, we do hope that people will do pre-planning rather than wait until it's an absolute necessity. So if you're pre-planning, it's a good idea to pay close attention to the prices for the items on the general price list. Go through it with a fine-tooth comb because there could be many, many pages of things that you can purchase. And be mindful of a tendency to fall in line and make choices based on whatever arrangements were made previously for other family members, without realizing there are many alternative options and cost-saving possibilities. So what might have been great for grandma or grandpa may not be good for you. Resist being lured by the razzle-dazzle appearances like shiny caskets and all the sorts of costly trappings to go with them, all the designs and the extra stuff that they put on the caskets. Be wary of particular models to which you are directed, realizing the suggestions could stem from profit-making motives. Ask to see the least expensive ones too. Be mindful that it is a business. Funeral homes are there to make money. Be on the lookout for terminology used in describing options. For example, the funeral home staff sometimes advance the notion of what's referred to as a memory picture, suggestive of lifelike images that's supposedly achievable through embalming. My suggestion is don't go on to the next topic or the next subject until you fully understand what's being said and what the terms mean in your mind.
Avoid the pitfall of opting for suggested items without thinking clearly due to fatigue or emotional turmoil. Ask for companion input. Avoid knee-jerk decisions without giving a second thought to realities, such as the fact that casket or vault bells and whistles won't matter once stationed underground or away from view. Be attuned to psychological influences when making funerary arrangements. It's so easy to get swept into an unfavorable mindset that dictates decision-making, such as a mistaken assumption that how much you spend is an indication of how much you cared for the loved one who died. Or excessive spending might be regarded as a way to offset your perceived neglect of the person while alive. Or concern for being judged could trigger the need to dutifully demonstrate honor by way of expensive fare, especially if the person had been a public figure.
Also take into account expenses beyond the funeral home that are part of the overall funerary cost equation. Most people don't realize that there are additional costs and need to be taken into consideration, such as the crematory fees. If the funeral home does not have its own cremation, they may have to transport the body to a crematory. There's additional fees for that. The cemetery space or the mausoleum, the niche that cremation urns would be placed in, the purchase of the cemetery plot. There's also charges for opening and closing a grave, and the headstone or marker. These are things that people don't usually think about when they go to a funeral home. They think it may be all inclusive, but the funeral home is just taking care of their portion of the funerary. There may be entombment fee for opening a mausoleum crypt and then resealing it. And don't forget the marker or headstone. That is also another purchase that is considered.
So much to consider at such a vulnerable time. Tell me, what would you consider to be an optimal outcome of funeral home arrangements?
I'd say a lingering sense of comfort and even gratification that everything had been handled transparently and in accordance with personal values and budgetary constraints.
There's, again, so much to consider, and you've provided a lot of information. And like Debbie, like you said, at a very vulnerable time. People, if they were pre-planning, might be able to avoid some of those emotional pitfalls.
And I really believe that all of this very important information, together with our previous conversations with episode, which was with Christopher Hassan, a funeral home director, can really, really meet the needs of all of us as we start to think about what we may want for ourselves, what we may want for our loved ones. So we thank you so much, Marjorie and Mary Ellen. Everything that you had to say was useful and informative and educational, presented in such a clear and sensitive way. So we're deeply, deeply grateful. Anybody from our viewers who would like to be in touch with Mary and Marjorie, you will see in our closing slide all of their contact information, and they've indicated that they welcome your inquiries. So please feel free to reach out and to continue the conversation with them. And for us, we hope that you will continue to join us for future episodes of Conversations With, as we continue to explore the nuances of our personal decision-making and planning. You're also welcome and encouraged to join us for our TLCs, our educational webinars that we provide on an almost weekly basis through ALS United Greater New York. Thank you so much, Marjorie, Mary Ellen, and Nancy, for joining us. And thank you to our audience for chiming in. Have a nice day.